I was standing at the door with a basket of cookies and a small toy car for my grandson when Melissa's voice cracked through the hallway. She screamed so loud the neighbors opened their doors. She called me an old leech, told Brian to throw me out, and spat words that cut deeper than any blade. My son stood frozen, not even meeting my eyes. The basket slipped from my hands, the cookies scattered across the floor, and my grandson looked at me with tears streaming down his cheeks. That was the moment my chest tightened, not from age or illness, but from a truth I never wanted to face. The family I had sacrificed everything for saw me as nothing more than a burden. What they did not know was that behind my modest cardigans and quiet evenings with books, I carried the weight of an $85 million fortune from the company my late husband and I built decades ago. I had kept it hidden, believing my son's happiness was worth more than money. But standing there, humiliated and stripped of dignity in front of strangers, I realized secrets can be weapons, and mine was about to change everything. I know many of you listening have felt the sting of being unwanted by those you love most. Maybe you have been called names, dismissed, or treated as if your years of sacrifice meant nothing. Stay with me, because what began in shame and tears did not end there. It turned into something no one in that building could ever forget. I picked up the toy car from the floor, brushed the dust off, and left the basket behind. My legs felt heavy, but my mind raced faster than it had in years. Every step down the hallway replayed Melissa's words, every syllable echoing. Old leech. Disgusting. Throw her out. I could still hear my grandson crying, his little hands reaching toward me as Brian pulled him back inside. The door slammed shut, and all I had left was the cold silence of the hallway and the stares of people who had seen too much. On the subway ride home, I kept my eyes on the window, though all I saw was my own reflection. Wrinkled, tired, carrying the face of a woman who had given decades of her life to raising a son alone after her husband's death. I remembered working 2 jobs, skipping meals so Brian could eat better, selling jewelry when tuition was due. Every sacrifice carved into my skin like invisible scars. Now the same son would not even raise his voice to defend me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the toy car resting on the wood. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. I thought about the life I had built here in Brooklyn, the long shelves of books, the framed photos that lined the hallway. Each one told a story of struggle, of a woman who clawed her way through grief and hardship. And still, in the eyes of my daughter-in-law, I was nothing more than an old leech. I closed my eyes and forced myself to relive the moment. The neighbors staring, Brian silent, Melissa's voice echoing. It was not just humiliation, it was fear. Fear that my old age had finally turned me invisible, that I could scream and no one would hear. Fear that all I was left with was a fragile body, an empty apartment, and the bitter taste of betrayal. But then my gaze shifted to the small safe in the corner of the room. Inside were the papers, the accounts, the hidden truth that no one in that family knew. $85 million. Investments that had grown quietly while I lived simply, dressing modestly and walking to the library each week. I had believed secrecy would keep peace in the family. Now I understood it had only made me vulnerable. The more I thought about Melissa's sneer, the more something hardened inside me. I had been silent too long. I had endured too much. They thought they had broken me, that I would simply vanish into the shadows. They were wrong. By midnight, I was no longer trembling. I was planning. My mind replayed every word Melissa had said, not as wounds, but as fuel. I realized she feared nothing because she thought I had nothing. Soon, she would learn how wrong she was. I pushed the toy car aside, opened my notebook, and began to write down names, numbers, and addresses. For the first time in years, I felt not old, not weak, but powerful. They had unleashed something they could not control. And so the quiet widow they mocked that night walked into a new dawn with fire in her veins. What came next was not forgiveness. It was retribution, sharp and deliberate, the kind that leaves scars not just on the body, but on the soul. The next morning I woke up with the image of that slammed door still etched into my mind. The sting of humiliation had not dulled overnight. It sharpened. I replayed the way Melissa's words echoed down the hallway, the way Brian stood motionless, and the way my grandson's cries were muffled as the door shut between us. I felt a heat rise in me that I had not known in years, the kind of heat that makes you act instead of wait. I did not sit quietly. I went straight to the bank. The clerk greeted me politely, but when I handed over my ID and requested the balance of all accounts, his eyes widened just slightly before he composed himself. The number on the screen confirmed everything I had hidden for decades. $85 million, spread across investments and savings, waiting. I had kept it secret out of fear that revealing it would poison the family. Now I realized hiding it had made me a target of disrespect, because they thought I was powerless. I walked out of that bank not as a weak old widow, but as someone holding a loaded weapon no one else could see. Later that day, I received a call from Brian. His voice was strained, nervous, as if Melissa stood close by listening. He started with pleasantries, a tone so foreign from the silence at the doorway the night before. He mentioned how hard things had been for him and Melissa, how the bills were stacking up, how the apartment felt too small, how opportunities for investment were slipping through their fingers. I could hear the desperation in the pauses, the rehearsed lines meant to soften me. He never said Melissa's name, but her shadow hovered over every word. I answered simply. I told him I had always supported him, but I would not be handing over my savings. My voice was calm, even. I could feel him swallow hard on the other end. He muttered something about understanding, and then hung up quickly. That evening the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Melissa stood there with a bright smile stretched so far it looked painted on. In her hands, she carried a bottle of wine, the cheap kind she thought I would not notice. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes darting around my apartment as if she were assessing it for value. She complimented the curtains, the bookshelves, even the way I arranged the chairs. Her voice dripped with sugar, but underneath I heard the grinding teeth of someone forcing every word. She finally sat down across from me and leaned in. Her tone lowered. She spoke about family, about trust, about how people should look out for each other. She said it was silly for me to carry the burden of managing accounts at my age, that Brian and she could take on that responsibility. She painted a picture of vacations together, of my grandson growing up in comfort, of me never worrying about anything again. Her eyes never left mine. It was not affection. It was calculation. I let her talk, let her spill every rehearsed line. Inside, I felt my hands grip the armrest so tight my knuckles ached. Each word was a reminder of the names she had screamed only hours before. Old leech. Disgusting. Throw her out. Now those same lips tried to kiss the air with false sweetness. When she finished, I leaned forward and spoke quietly. I told her I had lived long enough to recognize when kindness was counterfeit. I told her money had a way of showing people's true faces, and hers had been revealed in that hallway for everyone to see. I said I would not hand over a single dollar. The air went still. Her smile cracked, vanished, and what replaced it was raw fury. Her voice dropped the sugar. She called me selfish, accused me of clinging to money I did not deserve. She said Brian worked harder than I ever had, that I owed them, that without them I would rot alone. I stood, refusing to let her see my hands tremble. I told her to leave. She did not move. She grabbed the bottle of wine, slammed it onto the table so hard liquid spilled over the rim, and hissed that I would regret this. I opened the door wide. My heart pounded, but my face stayed cold. She finally stormed out, her heels striking the hallway like gunshots. As the door shut behind her, the silence felt heavier than the argument itself. I sank into the chair, my chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. I knew that was not the end. Melissa would not stop with insults and false smiles. She had seen the truth in my eyes when I refused her, and people like her never walked away empty-handed. For the first time in years, I welcomed the coming storm. I went to the safe again. I pulled out the files, the account statements, the deed to my apartment. My hands moved quickly now, no hesitation. The humiliation of yesterday had turned into resolve. I began making calls, attorneys, real estate brokers, people I had trusted long before Melissa came into this family. Each call was another brick in the wall I was building, not to protect myself, but to trap those who thought they could break me. That night I barely slept. The city outside buzzed as always, horns and sirens carrying through the windows, but my mind was locked on one goal. They thought they had silenced me with shame. What they had really done was awaken a part of me I had buried when my husband died. The part that fought, that strategized, that never surrendered. By sunrise, I was ready. The woman Melissa mocked in the hallway was gone. In her place stood someone who knew her worth, her strength, and the power of every dollar sitting quietly in accounts with her name on them. The game had shifted, and this time, I would not play gently. When Melissa showed up again 2 days later, I knew exactly what was coming. She did not bother with fake smiles this time. She pushed the door open before I could even invite her in, her eyes sharp, her voice clipped. She walked straight to my kitchen and dropped her purse on the table like she owned the place. Brian trailed behind her, shoulders hunched, avoiding my gaze. My grandson clutched a small toy, confused and quiet, sensing the tension that filled the air. Melissa wasted no time. She demanded to know why I was making things difficult, why I refused to hand over what she called dead money. She claimed it made no sense for someone my age to sit on wealth I could never spend. Her words came fast, each one sharper than the last, each one cutting away at any illusion that this was about family. She was not even pretending anymore. I stayed seated, my hands folded on the table. I watched her pace back and forth, her anger growing with every sentence. Brian stood silent near the door, his eyes fixed on the floor, his lips pressed into a thin line. I could see his shame, but shame did not erase betrayal. His silence was louder than Melissa's rage. I finally spoke, my voice steady, even. I told her my money was not hers to claim, not Brian's either. I reminded them of every sacrifice I had made, how I had built a life from scraps after my husband's death, how I had put Brian through school, helped them into their first apartment. I said that did not entitle anyone to strip me of what I had worked for. Melissa's face hardened. She picked up a wooden spoon from the counter, pointed it at me like a weapon, then threw it aside with a clatter. She grabbed the broom leaning against the wall and slammed the bristles against the floor, her knuckles white around the handle. She shouted that I was pathetic, a parasite clinging to wealth that would do me no good, that I would die alone surrounded by books and dust. Brian finally tried to intervene, but his words came out weak, almost apologetic. He told Melissa to calm down, but his tone carried no authority, no real intent to stop her. He was not protecting me. He was protecting his own peace from the storm she created. That was when it hit me fully. My son had chosen silence over dignity, fear over loyalty. He had chosen her over me. Melissa took a step closer, the broom still in her hands. My grandson whimpered, clutching his toy tighter. The boy's eyes darted between his mother and me, confusion etched into his little face. I could feel my heart break again, but the pain only fueled the fire already burning inside me. I rose from my chair, not quickly but deliberately, letting the weight of my movement speak louder than any words. I told Melissa that every time she opened her mouth, she proved exactly why she would never touch a cent of my money. I told Brian that his silence was worse than her insults, because he was my son, and yet he allowed his wife to tear me apart piece by piece without lifting a hand to stop it. Melissa lunged forward, swinging the broom toward me as if to drive me out of my own kitchen. The bristles brushed my shoulder, not enough to hurt, but enough to humiliate. My grandson cried out, dropping his toy, covering his ears. That sound seared into me deeper than any insult. I looked Melissa dead in the eye and told her that one day she would pay for every word, every gesture, every moment she tried to strip me of my dignity. Her laugh was sharp, cruel, echoing off the walls. She called me dramatic, said no one would ever take my side, that I was nothing but a bitter old woman clinging to fantasies of power. But her laugh wavered when she saw that I did not flinch. She could swing that broom all she wanted. She could spit venom until her throat was raw. But she would never break me again. Brian finally pulled the broom from her hands and set it against the wall, his face pale, his breathing uneven. He muttered that they should go, that this was not worth the fight. Melissa jerked her arm free from his grip, snarled at me one last time, and stormed out. The slam of the door rattled the frames on the walls. Brian lingered, eyes meeting mine for the first time. What I saw was not guilt, it was defeat. Then he left without a word. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, the toy car lying abandoned on the floor. I picked it up and placed it gently on the table. My hands shook, but my resolve did not. The confrontation had burned away the last remnants of fear. I knew then that Melissa was not just cruel, she was dangerous, and Brian's weakness made him complicit. I sat down again, breathing hard, letting the fury settle into something colder. I thought of every name she had called me, every time Brian's silence had cut deeper than her screams. I thought of the broom pressed against my shoulder, the humiliation of being driven out like an unwanted stray. And I thought of the accounts, the deeds, the power that sat quietly in my name. Humiliation had ended the night I left their doorway. Resolve had taken root at the bank. But this moment, standing against Melissa with her broom in hand, was the breaking point. There was no going back. I would not hide any more. I would not let fear dictate silence. I had the means, I had the will, and now I had the fury to see it through. I rose once more and walked to the safe. My fingers moved over the cold steel, unlocking it, pulling out the thick folder of documents. I spread them across the table, the weight of each page heavy with possibility. I did not just see numbers. I saw leverage. I saw freedom. I saw justice. The old leech she mocked in that hallway no longer existed. What remained was a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from striking back. My breath steadied, my vision sharpened. I whispered to myself the words I would never forget. They wanted a parasite. They created a predator. I left the documents spread across my kitchen table that night, but I did not sleep. The humiliation was finished. The silence was finished. The broom that had brushed my shoulder still burned like a brand. I had crossed a threshold, and I was not going back. By morning, My plan was already alive. The first call I made was to the attorney I had trusted when my husband was alive. His name carried weight, not just in the courts, but in the circles where money and property shifted hands, like cards in a high-stakes game. I told him I needed every record of ownership for the building where Brian and Melissa lived. I needed to know who controlled it, who held the deeds, and how quickly they might be ready to sell. He did not ask questions. He promised me answers. The next call was to a broker. My voice was cold, precise. I was not asking for advice. I was giving instructions. Find me the leverage. Find me the opening. I had 85 million reasons to be taken seriously, and I was done being quiet. By noon, I had confirmation. The building was owned by a corporation that had been bleeding money for months. Maintenance deferred, loans overdue, tenants complaining. They were looking for a buyer, someone who could step in fast with cash in hand. I was exactly the kind of storm they had been waiting for. I sat back in my chair, my pulse racing, not from fear, but from power. The same woman Melissa had shoved and insulted was about to hold the roof over her head. My hands trembled, not from age, but from anticipation. That afternoon, Brian called again. His tone was softer, but no less scripted. He said Melissa had been upset, that she had gone too far. He said they wanted to talk, to have dinner together, to make things right. The lies rolled smoothly off his tongue, but I heard the emptiness beneath them. He was not apologizing. He was negotiating. I cut him off. I told him I had no interest in dinners or apologies. I told him words meant nothing when silence had already betrayed me. The line went dead quiet. He muttered that Melissa was only trying to protect their future. He stumbled over his sentences, his voice fraying at the edges. I answered without hesitation. I told him Melissa had no future if it depended on mine. His breath caught, and then he said nothing more. He ended the call with a weak goodbye, the kind that sounded final. That evening, Melissa arrived again, this time without Brian. She pounded on the door until I opened it. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp. She stepped inside as if daring me to stop her. She accused me of turning Brian against her, of trying to break their marriage. She accused me of being jealous of her place in his life, of clinging to a role that no longer belonged to me. Her voice climbed higher with each accusation, bouncing off the walls of my apartment. I let her finish. Then I told her exactly what I had done that day. I told her I knew who owned the building she lived in. I told her the corporation was desperate, and I was already in talks to buy it. Her smirk froze, her mouth opening slightly before snapping shut. I told her that the roof over her head would soon belong to me, that the lease she signed would soon be under my control. For the first time, she looked afraid. Not angry, not smug, but genuinely shaken. She tried to laugh it off, but her voice cracked. She said I was bluffing, that I did not have the resources, that no one would sell to me. I leaned closer and told her I had more than enough to burn her world down and never feel the loss. She lunged across the table, slamming her hand down so hard the lamp rattled. She told me I would regret crossing her, that she would drag Brian away from me forever, that I would never see my grandson again. The threat hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor. My voice cut through her rant like a blade. I told her she had already taken Brian from me, not with words, but with the silence he chose when she spat in my face. I told her the grandson she dangled like bait would one day see the truth, and when he did, he would know who carried dignity and who carried poison. Melissa's face twisted, fury and fear clashing in her eyes. She grabbed her purse, nearly tearing the strap, and stormed out without another word. The door slammed so hard the frame shook. I stood in the silence, breathing hard, my pulse still racing. I turned back to the table, to the folder of documents spread wide. Each page was a weapon now. Each signature, each number, each line of fine print was a tool I would use to take back the respect they thought they had stripped from me. That night I signed the first set of papers. My attorney confirmed the corporation was ready to move quickly. The funds were transferred. The process had begun. In days, the building would belong to me. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady now. I walked to the window and looked out at the Brooklyn skyline, the lights flickering like stars over concrete. I thought of Melissa's face when I told her the truth, the way her smirk collapsed into silence. That image was worth more than every dollar in the bank. But it was not just about revenge. It was about reclaiming power they had tried to steal with words, with silence, with cruelty. I had been dismissed as old, useless, a leech. Soon, I would be the hand that decided whether the lights in their apartment stayed on or went out. I closed the folder, locked it back into the safe, and felt the final thread of fear snap. The humiliation was behind me. The war had begun. The day the deal was finalized, I felt the ground shift beneath me. The building where Brian and Melissa lived was now mine. The signatures were fresh, the ink still drying, but the power had already transferred. For years I had been told I was powerless, a relic, an old woman with nothing left but memories. Now I held the paper that said otherwise. I did not wait. I walked into that building with my attorney by my side, carrying the folder that sealed their fate. Tenants gathered in the hallway, curious, murmuring. Melissa appeared at the top of the stairs, her arms folded, her expression smug until she saw who stood beside me. Her eyes flicked to the folder in my hands, and for a moment I saw panic crack her mask. I called for a meeting in the lobby. Tenants filled the space, whispering, restless. Melissa and Brian stood off to the side, Melissa whispering harshly into his ear, her nails digging into his arm. I began without preamble. I told them the building had been sold. I told them the new owner was standing in front of them. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing in on every corner of the room. Melissa laughed, sharp and shrill, trying to break the tension. She told everyone it was a trick, that I was making up stories to humiliate her. My attorney stepped forward, holding up the signed documents, and read aloud the details of the sale. Gasps rippled through the tenants. Melissa's laugh died in her throat. I turned to her then, my voice carrying through the room. I told her the roof over her head, the walls around her, the locks on her doors. They all belonged to me now. Every rent check, every complaint, every request would pass through my hands. Her smirk vanished, replaced with the rigid stillness of someone trapped. Brian finally spoke, his voice strained. He said this was unnecessary, that I was going too far. He tried to plead for reason, for family. But I cut him off. I told him family had already been shattered when he chose silence while his wife spat venom at me in front of my grandson. I said there was no going back, no repairing what had been broken. Melissa's fury ignited. She lunged forward, pointing her finger at me, shouting that I was vindictive, bitter, insane. She screamed that she would never bow to me, that I could not control her life. I let her words pour out, her rage filling the room. Then I pulled out my phone and pressed play. The video filled the silence. Her voice, recorded by a neighbor, calling me a parasite, an old leech, demanding I be thrown out. The tenants watched, listened, their eyes widening. Some shook their heads, others whispered to each other. Melissa froze, her own words echoing back at her, undeniable and raw. I watched her face crumble under the weight of her own cruelty. For once she had no rebuttal, no disguise. Brian's face turned pale, his lips trembling, as the truth spread through the room like fire. The neighbors who had pitied me now glared at her. The respect she thought she commanded shattered in an instant. I stepped closer, my voice steady, sharp. I told her the days of humiliation were over. I told her that every insult she had hurled had built the very wall now closing in around her. I said she had mistaken silence for weakness, and now she would learn the difference. She tried to rally, shouting that money could not buy dignity, that I was pathetic for using wealth as a weapon. But her voice shook, her eyes darting around the room, searching for support that never came. Brian stood silent, his shoulders slumped, unable to defend her or himself. The crowd broke into murmurs, then outright condemnation. Tenants who had once nodded politely to her now spoke aloud, voicing the things they had witnessed, the arrogance, the disrespect. Melissa shrank under their words, her power dissolving in real time. I delivered the final blow. I announced that every tenant would be given a choice of renewed leases under fair conditions, except for one. Brian and Melissa would be given 30 days to vacate unless they agreed to sign under the new terms, double the rent, no exceptions, no favors. Gasps echoed again, but no one questioned it. The law was on my side. Melissa's scream rang through the lobby, sharp enough to make my grandson cry upstairs. She turned on Brian, slapping his arm, demanding he do something. He said nothing, his eyes locked on the floor. She stormed toward me, but the crowd stepped between us, blocking her path. She was no longer feared. She was pitied, and worse, despised. I turned away from her then, not out of weakness, but out of triumph. I had said what needed to be said, done what needed to be done. The humiliation she had tried to bury me with now wrapped around her like chains. That night, I sat in my apartment with the city lights spread out before me. The folder lay closed on the table, the victory sealed. My chest was still heavy with the memory of her insults, but now that weight had shifted. It was no longer a burden, it was fuel, transformed into something sharp and unyielding. I thought of my grandson, the fear in his eyes when Melissa raised that broom. I thought of the future, of the lesson he would one day learn. That respect cannot be stolen, that dignity cannot be erased, and that silence in the face of cruelty is its own betrayal. Melissa had tried to strip me of everything. Instead, she had forged something stronger. The old woman she mocked no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had turned pain into power, fear into fire. The building was mine, the truth was exposed, and the balance had shifted for good. The night after the lobby meeting, word spread through the building like wildfire. Tenants whispered in hallways, doors opened and shut with hurried conversations, and everywhere Melissa turned, she felt the burn of eyes judging her. By morning, she was already unraveling. The air had shifted. No one saw her as the polished, controlling wife anymore. They saw her as the woman who called her mother-in-law a parasite, and now lived in fear under that same mother-in-law's roof. I could feel the shift, too. The shame that had once wrapped around me like chains was gone. In its place was a kind of power I had never known. It was not about money, not about property. It was about standing tall where they thought I would crawl. I carried myself differently that day, and everyone could see it. When I went to collect the first round of documents from tenants agreeing to new leases, Melissa intercepted me in the stairwell. Her hair was wild, her eyes bloodshot, her voice cracked with sleeplessness. She blocked my path, her body rigid. She hissed that I had ruined her, that I had turned the entire building against her. Her words spat like venom, dripping with rage. I held her gaze. I told her she had ruined herself with her own mouth, that her cruelty had only caught up with her. She lunged forward, jabbing her finger into my shoulder, shouting that she would never bow to me. Tenants peeked out from their doors, watching. Some shook their heads, some whispered, and Melissa's voice grew louder, more frantic, until it cracked into a scream. Brian appeared at the top of the stairs, his face pale. He rushed down, trying to pull her away, but Melissa shoved him back. She accused him of weakness, of siding with me. She ranted that he was nothing without her, that she was the one who had built their life, that I had poisoned everything. Her fury turned on him as much as me. The stairwell echoed with her rage. My grandson appeared behind Brian, clutching the banister, eyes wide with fear. That sight cut me deeper than any insult. I told Melissa that every word she spoke was another scar on her own son, that the boy would remember the day his mother lost control and turned their home into a battlefield. Melissa shrieked, her voice breaking, and in that instant, I saw her mask shatter completely. She was no longer the smug, manipulative woman who whispered in Brian's ear. She was raw desperation, flailing against a truth she could not fight. Brian tried again to calm her, his hands trembling as he reached for her arm. She slapped him hard across the chest, her voice cracking as she screamed that he was pathetic, that he had failed her, that even his own mother could outmatch him. The tenants gasped. Some stepped forward, pulling my grandson back into safety. Melissa was unraveling in front of everyone, and there was no stopping it. I spoke then, my voice cutting through the chaos like steel. I told her this was the end of her reign, that the cruelty she had poured out had come home to roost. I told her the boy upstairs would one day know that his grandmother did not cower, that she stood her ground. My words hung in the air, steady and unshaken, while Melissa's rage spun her in circles. She collapsed onto the stairwell landing, sobbing and screaming, pounding her fists against the floor. Brian crouched beside her, his voice low, begging her to stop. But the tenants had already seen everything they needed to see. Her downfall was complete, not behind closed doors, but in full view of the people she once lorded over. I turned away and continued down the stairs, my attorney following close behind. The papers in my hands were heavier now, not with ink, but with victory. Each signature from the tenants was another reminder that the building, the respect, and the power were mine. When I stepped outside, the city air felt different. The weight of years of humiliation had lifted. I thought of the broom striking my shoulder, the door slamming in my face, the words "old leech" echoing down the hallway. They no longer stung. They fueled me. That night, I received a message from my attorney. The last signatures had been filed. Legally and publicly, there was no doubt left. I was the sole owner of the building. The news would spread beyond the tenants now. Melissa's humiliation would stretch further, reaching family, friends, co-workers. Her cruelty had not just backfired, it had detonated. I sat in my apartment, the toy car my grandson had dropped resting on the table. I traced its edges, thinking of the boy who had watched his mother scream and crumble in the stairwell. I thought of the silence Brian had chosen again and again, silence that had become its own betrayal. I thought of Melissa, broken but still dangerous, seething in her apartment, plotting her next move even through tears. But I also thought of myself. The woman they thought was weak had risen higher than ever before. The same age that they mocked as useless had become my shield, my weapon. I had nothing left to lose, and that made me unstoppable. I closed my eyes, steadying my breath. The war was not finished. This was only the beginning of the end. Melissa had been humiliated, exposed, but she was not the kind to surrender quietly. I knew she would strike again, harder, more desperate. And I was ready. The city lights flickered outside my window, 1,000 stories unfolding at once. Mine was no longer a story of shame. It was a story of power reclaimed, of a voice once silenced now echoing through every hallway of that building. By the time dawn arrived, I was no longer trembling. I was waiting. And when Melissa made her next move, I would be there, not as her victim, but as her reckoning. The morning after Melissa's collapse in the stairwell, I knew she would not stay down. A woman like her did not surrender in front of witnesses without trying to claw her way back. Sure enough, before noon, I heard the thud of her heels echoing through the hallway. She was dragging Brian along, her hand locked around his wrist, her voice carrying through the walls with forced calm. She had something planned, and it would not be quiet. I braced myself as they stopped outside my door. Melissa's voice came, brittle, but loud enough for neighbors to hear. She declared she wanted to clear the air, that there had been misunderstandings, that family deserved unity. Her words were sugary, but the tone underneath cut sharp as glass. She wanted an audience, not reconciliation. I opened the door, and there she stood, dressed impeccably as if fabric could mask the chaos in her eyes. Brian stood beside her, pale and rigid, his gaze fixed on the floor. She pushed past me without invitation, pulling him inside like a hostage. The living room became a stage. Melissa perched herself in the center, smoothing her skirt, and announced that she was willing to forgive the tension as long as I recognized my place. She said an elderly widow had responsibilities, that stability meant stepping back, letting the younger generation handle assets and decisions. She spoke as if she were gracious, as if she were granting me mercy. I did not answer right away. I let her voice fill the air, let it grow confident with her own echo. Then I laid the bank statements on the coffee table, the ones showing the full account, the untouched 85 million, the savings she had whispered about but never seen. The room stilled. Brian lifted his head for the first time, his eyes flicking between the papers and me. Melissa's hands froze mid-gesture. For a second, she could not breathe. Her mask cracked just enough for me to see the hunger burning through. I told her calmly that my life had been built on sacrifice, that what I had saved was mine, not hers. I said she had no claim, no right, no entitlement to a cent of it. The tension in the room thickened like smoke. Melissa leaned forward, her voice trembling with rage wrapped in false sweetness. She said families share, that what benefits one benefits all, that holding back resources was selfish. Her hands trembled as she tried to flip the papers toward her, but I slapped them back flat against the table. The silence that followed was electric. Then I spoke, louder this time, so Brian and the walls themselves could hear. I said Melissa had treated me like trash, called me names, struck me with objects, tried to erase me from my grandson's life, and now she wanted a reward. My voice shook the air. I said cruelty did not entitle anyone to inheritance. Melissa shot to her feet, screaming that she would not live in a world where I controlled everything. She demanded Brian speak, demanded he defend her. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, the words stuck in his throat. The shame in his eyes told me he knew the truth, but lacked the courage to speak it. That was when I made my move. I opened the folder sitting beside me, the one filled with affidavits from tenants and witnesses, all sworn statements of her behavior, every insult, every assault, every humiliation. I laid them one by one on the table, my hand steady, my eyes never leaving hers. Each page was a nail in the coffin of her reputation. Melissa's face twisted. She reached for Brian's arm again, but he pulled back. For the first time, he put space between them. That small motion that was louder than any words. I told her she was finished, that her voice carried no weight in this house or this building, that the law, the tenants, and even her husband had seen the truth. My tone was final, and it landed like a hammer. Melissa's composure shattered. She lunged at me, hands outstretched, but Brian intercepted her. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her back as she shrieked, her voice breaking into incoherence. She kicked, clawed, screamed, but he dragged her toward the door. Her voice echoed down the hall, curses mixing with sobs, a woman unraveling in public again. When the door slammed shut behind them, silence washed over me. I sat down slowly, my hands trembling now that the storm had passed. The toy car on the shelf caught my eye again, a reminder of why I had endured, why I had chosen to stand and not bow. But I also knew this was not the end. Melissa had been humiliated twice now, exposed and restrained, but desperation makes people dangerous. She had seen the money with her own eyes. She would not walk away. She would strike back, harder, more reckless than before. As I stacked the papers back into the folder, I felt both exhaustion and fire. The war had left bruises, visible and hidden, but I had survived every battle. Now the fight was shifting into something larger, something I would not fight alone. The tenants, the law, and even Brian had seen the cracks. The next confrontation would be different. I leaned back in the chair, letting the silence settle. My pulse slowed, but the determination did not fade. Melissa had declared war. I had accepted, and I was not afraid anymore. Melissa did not stay quiet after the confrontation in my apartment. By the next morning, the whole building felt it. Tenants who once whispered in hallways now gathered in clusters, their voices sharp with curiosity and judgment. Word had spread not just about her breakdown, but about the money she had finally seen. $85 million. It was no longer a rumor, no longer whispers behind doors. Now it was fuel, and Melissa carried that fire like a torch she was ready to burn me with. She tried to turn the narrative in her favor. She walked into the lobby, dressed like she was heading for a courtroom, chin high, lips curled into a practiced smile. She declared loudly that she was protecting her family, that I was unstable, hoarding wealth, using age as a shield while plotting to ruin my own son. Every word was designed to paint herself as the victim. She made sure tenants heard it, made sure Brian stood nearby, silent but complicit. I stepped forward before she could build momentum. My voice cut through hers, calm but carrying enough force to silence the crowd. I told them her story was a lie, that every action she had taken had been recorded, witnessed, documented. I reminded them of the broom, the insults, the scene in the stairwell. I did not shout. I did not need to. The truth had a weight that her words could never match. Melissa's mask faltered. She turned to Brian, begging him to support her, her voice suddenly trembling with false fragility. Brian's lips parted, but no words came. The tenants waited, eyes fixed on him. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. Melissa snapped. She screamed that he was weak, that he had let his own mother poison him against her. She lashed out, her hand striking his shoulder, her voice shrill enough to echo off the marble walls of the lobby. Tenants gasped, some pulling out phones. The image was seared into everyone's minds. A wife unraveling in public, not just at her mother-in-law, but at her own husband. I did not move. I let the silence stretch, let the sound of her collapse linger. Then I spoke, my words slow and deliberate. I said cruelty always reveals itself in the end, that it was not me exposing her. It was her own mouth, her own hands, her own rage. Brian lowered his head. For the first time, he stepped away from her. just a single step, but it was enough to tell the crowd what they needed to know. Melissa was alone, her face twisted with fury. She stormed out, dragging Brian by the sleeve, screaming that she would not be humiliated again. But humiliation had already rooted itself in her shadow. She could not escape it now. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by papers and folders. My attorney had prepared everything: statements from tenants, documents proving ownership, evidence of Melissa's actions. But what struck me most was not the paper. It was the toy car still sitting on my table, untouched. It reminded me why I was fighting, why every insult had become fuel instead of a wound. The next day, Melissa struck back with a vengeance. She marched into the building's community room during a tenant meeting I had scheduled. She barged in with a stack of papers in her hands, waving them in the air. She shouted that I was manipulating everyone, that I had stolen the building through deceit, that I was hiding secrets no one knew. Her eyes burned, her voice cracked, her body shook with desperation. I stood calmly, letting her spew venom. Then I walked forward, took the papers from her trembling hands, and laid them flat on the table. They were nothing. Old invoices, meaningless clippings, scraps that proved nothing but her desperation. The room buzzed with murmurs, eyes turning away from her. Melissa's fury exploded. She screamed that I was destroying her, that she would see me ruined, that Brian's loyalty would never belong to me. She lunged across the table, her hands clutching the edge so tightly her knuckles went white. I met her eyes and spoke clearly so every tenant could hear. I told her this was no longer about family. This was about respect, dignity, and survival. I told her the world was watching now, that her cruelty was no longer hidden behind closed doors. Her downfall was not my doing. It was hers. Melissa's body shook. She turned to Brian, demanding again that he speak. But Brian's shoulders sagged, his face hollow. He whispered that he was tired, that he could not defend her anymore. The words broke her. She screamed, shoved the chair across the room, and stormed out, her footsteps echoing down the hall like cracks in the walls themselves. The meeting ended not with fear, but with resolve. Tenants came to me afterward, offering signatures, offering solidarity. The building was no longer divided. It was united against her. That night, I sat alone again, the city humming outside my window. The fire in my chest no longer felt like rage. It felt like clarity. Melissa had lost her mask. Brian had lost his shield. And I had found my voice. But I knew this was not the end. The louder she screamed, the closer she came to breaking. The next strike would not be words. It would be something darker, more desperate. And I was ready. The storm came sooner than I expected. 2 days after the tenant meeting, Melissa staged her grand attempt to seize control. She burst into the lobby during peak hours, dragging Brian beside her, her face twisted with manic determination. In her hands was a folder thicker than any I had seen her carry before. She shouted that this was the day the truth would be exposed, that I was not who I claimed to be, that my wealth was not legitimate. Tenants froze mid-step, their conversations cut short. Phones came out. The lobby turned into a theatre, and Melissa was determined to be the star. She slammed the folder on the desk and began pulling out documents, waving them like banners. She screamed that she had evidence of fraud, that I had manipulated accounts, that my fortune had been built on deceit. Her voice cracked, but her eyes gleamed with the thrill of spectacle. I stood calmly, watching her unravel. She had no real proof. She had scraps, pieces of paper taken out of context, twisted into lies. Still, she performed as if she were unveiling a scandal that would bring me to my knees. Brian stood silent, his face drained, a man tethered to a storm he no longer believed in. When she paused for breath, I stepped forward. My attorney was already there, briefcase in hand, and with one sharp motion, he opened it and laid out our own folder. Real documents, bank records, ownership deeds, witness affidavits. He slid them across the desk, one by one, as if each page was a hammer blow. The contrast was brutal. Her chaos versus our order, her lies versus our truth. Melissa's voice rose higher, desperate to drown out the silence of her collapsing case. She screamed that the tenants were fools, that they were being manipulated, that Brian was being turned against her. Her words grew incoherent, spit flying as she jabbed her finger toward me, toward my attorney, toward anyone who dared look her in the eye. I spoke then, my voice low but steady. I told the crowd that this was not about money, not about papers, not even about property. This was about dignity, about how a woman had spent years tearing another human being down, stripping her of respect, calling her names, humiliating her in her own grandson's eyes. I said Melissa had mistaken cruelty for power, and that cruelty always devours its owner in the end. The lobby went silent. Melissa froze, her chest heaving, her hands trembling over the useless papers. For the first time, the weight of her own actions pressed down on her in front of everyone. Brian finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried. He said he was done. He said he had stood by in silence for too long, that he had let his wife speak for him, act for him, destroy his family in his name. He said he would not do it anymore. His words cut sharper than any evidence I could have presented. Melissa's body stiffened. She turned on him, eyes blazing, calling him weak, pathetic, worthless. She raised her hand as if to strike him, but he caught her wrist mid-air. The tenants gasped. The image was seared into the room. Brian stopping her violence, choosing to stand against her for the first time. I stepped closer, my voice rising, not with rage but with finality. I told her she was finished, that she had lost the building, lost the tenants, lost the respect of the man she claimed to control, and most of all, she had lost the war she thought she could win with insults and deceit. Melissa broke then. She screamed, a raw, guttural sound, and collapsed against the desk, her body shaking with sobs. She clutched the meaningless papers to her chest like a shield, but they fluttered from her grasp and scattered across the floor. Tenants stepped around them, unimpressed, unafraid. Brian walked toward me, his face pale but resolute. He said he wanted to help undo the damage, that he would stand by me in whatever came next. I nodded, not out of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. It was his first act of courage, late but necessary. Melissa was escorted out by security, her voice trailing behind her in shrieks that no one believed anymore. The lobby doors closed, and with them, the last remnants of her control. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by people who had seen everything. Their nods, their quiet affirmations, told me the tide had turned completely. Melissa's reign of cruelty had ended, not with my destruction, but with her own. That night, I sat by the window, the toy car still on the table beside me. The city glowed outside, but it was the silence inside that felt most powerful. Melissa's downfall was not just my victory. It was proof that no amount of cruelty could erase a lifetime of resilience. I felt the scars, yes, but I also felt the strength that had carried me here. And I knew this was only the beginning of the final reckoning. The public battle was over. The private one, between her and me, was still to come. The day after Melissa was dragged from the lobby, I expected her to disappear into silence, at least for a while. But silence was never in her nature. She came back swinging, and this time Her weapon was not her voice or scraps of paper. It was something darker, the kind of strike you feel in your bones before you even see it coming. Late that afternoon, the building buzzed with rumors. Tenants whispered that Melissa had been making calls, telling anyone who would listen that she had evidence I was unfit to manage finances, that my age had caught up with me, that I was slipping into senility. She painted me as dangerous, incapable, a woman who hoarded wealth while her own mind failed. By the time the whispers reached me, I knew it was more than gossip. She was preparing to drag me into a courtroom, hoping to strip me of control not by winning respect, but by claiming incompetence. When the notice came, I was not surprised. A petition for guardianship. Melissa had filed papers in court, claiming I needed oversight, that I was unfit to handle my own affairs. She had Brian's name typed beside hers, though I doubted he even knew. It was a direct strike at my autonomy, the cruelest blow yet. That evening, I called a meeting with my attorney and the tenants who had stood with me. We gathered in the community room, the air tense, the sound of the city muffled by the thick walls. I laid out the papers Melissa had filed, my voice steady but edged with fire. I told them this was not just about me. This was about every elder who had been told they were too old, too fragile, too weak to decide their own life. The tenants rallied without hesitation. They offered testimonies, statements, anything to prove I was fully capable, that Melissa's claims were lies. My attorney assured me we could dismantle her case, that the evidence was on our side. But my chest still burned. This was not just legal. This was personal. Melissa had tried to erase me once by humiliation. Now she was trying to erase me on paper, in ink and law. The next day in court, the scene was almost theatrical. Melissa arrived dressed in somber black, as if she were mourning. Brian trailed behind, his face grey, his steps dragging. She played her part with precision, telling the judge she was only concerned for my safety, that I was reckless with money, that I had grown paranoid and aggressive. Her voice cracked with rehearsed emotion, her hand clutching tissues she did not use. When it was my turn, I stood tall. My attorney guided me through the statements, through the records of sound financial decisions, through the witness accounts of my clarity and control. Each word was a blade, cutting through her performance. The judge listened, his eyes flicking between us, weighing not just words but demeanor. Melissa grew restless. She interrupted, objected, her voice rising higher with every denial. She could not contain her fury, and it spilled into the courtroom. She called me manipulative, accused me of turning the tenants against her, accused Brian of betrayal. She snapped at her own lawyer, her mask slipping in front of the one person she needed to impress. Then came the moment that split the air. My attorney handed over the final piece of evidence. A recording, captured by a tenant in the stairwell weeks earlier. Melissa's voice filled the courtroom, sharp and cruel, calling me a leech, screaming at Brian, lashing out in rage. The room went silent except for her own voice echoing from the speakers. There was no defense, no twist of words could erase it. Melissa's face drained of color. She tried to laugh it off, to say it was taken out of context. But the damage was done. The judge leaned forward, his gavel striking once. He ruled immediately. The petition was dismissed. I was declared fully competent, my autonomy untouched, my control unchallenged. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Some shook their heads at Melissa's audacity. Others stared at her with open disgust. Brian sank into his chair, his face buried in his hands. Melissa stood frozen, trembling, her eyes darting wildly as if searching for someone to blame. I did not gloat. I simply turned, gathered my papers, and walked out. The crowd parted for me, not for her. That was victory enough. Outside, the sun hit my face with a warmth I had not felt in years. It was not just a legal win, it was a reclamation of dignity, a public unmasking of cruelty. Melissa had tried to strip me of my identity, and instead, she had revealed her own. That night, I sat alone in my apartment. The toy car was still on the table, small and silent, a reminder of why I had endured. I thought of my grandson, of the day he would grow old enough to understand. I thought of Melissa, broken and seething, plotting her next desperate move even as her world crumbled. And I thought of myself, stronger, steadier, no longer silenced. I had fought battles I never asked for, and I had won. But I knew the war was not done. Melissa's hatred would not die quietly. She would strike again. Yet for the first time, I did not fear it. I welcomed it, because each battle only made me stronger, and each defeat brought her closer to the edge of her own collapse. Melissa did not vanish after the courtroom defeat. If anything, she came back sharper, more desperate, clawing for control like an animal backed into a corner. The humiliation in front of the judge had carved deep wounds into her pride, and she refused to let them scab. That evening, the building buzzed again with rumors. Melissa had cornered Brian in the parking lot, her voice carrying through the cold air. Tenants heard her screaming that he had betrayed her, that he had chosen his mother over his wife, that he was weak, spineless, nothing without her. By the time I stepped outside, Brian was slumped against the hood of his car, his head in his hands. Melissa paced like a caged predator, her heels striking the concrete with sharp cracks. When she saw me, her eyes flared and her voice rose to a piercing shriek. She shouted that I had destroyed her marriage, her reputation, her entire life. She spat the words with venom, each syllable aimed to pierce me. I stood tall, refusing to flinch. I told her that her marriage had been destroyed by her own cruelty, that her reputation was a product of her own actions, not mine. My voice cut steady and sharp, and for a moment she faltered, her breath catching on the raw truth of it. Brian finally lifted his head. His face was grey, his eyes hollow. He spoke quietly but firmly, telling Melissa that he was done living in fear of her temper, done covering for her lies, done pretending she was the victim. His words trembled, but they carried more force than anything he had ever said in her presence. Melissa's face twisted in fury. She lunged at him, her hand raised, but he stepped back, putting distance between them. Tenants gathered, drawn by the shouting, their eyes wide as the scene unfolded. Melissa's voice cracked with desperation as she hurled insult after insult, her body trembling with rage. She demanded loyalty, demanded obedience, demanded he stand against me. Brian shook his head. He said he would no longer be her shield, no longer allow her poison to seep through their family. He said their son deserved better than a mother who tore everyone down to lift herself up. His words struck her like blows, and she staggered, her fury faltering into disbelief, but only for a moment. Then she turned her rage on me. She screamed that I had poisoned Brian, stolen him away, twisted him against her. She called me a parasite, an old leech feeding off her life. Her voice cracked, shrill and raw, echoing off the walls of the garage. I stepped forward, my voice rising above hers. I told her she had no power left, that every attempt she made to destroy me only revealed her cruelty more clearly to the world. I told her that cruelty, once unmasked, could never regain its disguise. The words landed like stones, each one hitting its mark. Melissa's breathing grew ragged, her hands shook. For the first time, I saw not just rage, but fear in her eyes. Fear that the war she had waged so confidently was slipping out of her control. She turned to Brian, her voice breaking, pleading now instead of demanding. She begged him to stand with her, to remember their vows, to choose her over me. Brian's silence was her answer. He walked past her, his shoulders heavy, and stopped at my side. He did not look at her as he spoke. He said he was staying with me tonight. His voice was low but final. The sound shattered what little composure Melissa had left. She screamed, a sound so raw it silenced the crowd. She clawed at the air, her body shaking as she hurled curses at both of us. She raged that she would take everything, that neither of us would be left standing. Her voice echoed long after she stormed out, the sound of her heels fading into the night. When the garage emptied, Brian and I stood in the silence. He looked older than his years, worn down by years of silence and complicity. He admitted he had let Melissa's cruelty go unchecked, that his silence had been its own kind of betrayal. His words cracked, heavy with shame. I listened, my chest heavy, knowing his guilt was real, but also knowing the road ahead would demand more than words. Back in my apartment, I sat at the table with the toy car still resting there, untouched. I thought of my grandson, of what he had seen, of what he would remember. I thought of Melissa, her fury unraveling into desperation, her power slipping through her fingers. I thought of Brian, standing on the edge of redemption, but not yet across it. This was not the end. Melissa would not go quietly. She would lash out again, more reckless, more dangerous. But I no longer felt fear. What I felt was resolve. The war was reaching its final act. Melissa's mask was gone. Her rage had consumed her. And soon, the truth would consume her too. The final confrontation came not in the lobby or the courtroom, but in the quiet of my own apartment. Melissa appeared at the door late one evening, her face pale, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. She looked smaller, as if the rage that had fueled her for so long had finally burned through what was left of her strength. She did not storm inside this time. She stood in the doorway, trembling, her voice thin. She said she had nothing left. Her friends had abandoned her, the tenants despised her, and even Brian had walked away. She whispered that she was sorry, but the words carried no weight, too brittle to hold. I let her speak. I did not interrupt, though every syllable reminded me of years of cruelty. The broom, the insults, the nights I had gone to bed with tears burning my cheeks. She asked for forgiveness, but her eyes were still restless, darting as if searching for leverage. I told her calmly that forgiveness was not something I could hand out like a gift. It was something she would have to earn by changing, by rebuilding what she had broken. She sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. For a long time she sobbed, and I sat silently, letting the sound fill the room. At last, she lifted her head, her voice hoarse. She said she hated me because I was strong, because no matter how much she tried to crush me, I stood back up. She admitted she wanted to be feared, because deep down she was terrified of being forgotten. Those words carried a truth I had never expected to hear. Brian arrived then, his face heavy with shame, but also with determination. He told Melissa he could not undo the damage, but he wanted to try to be a better man, a better father, a better son. He asked her to face the consequences of what she had done, instead of running from them. His words were steady this time, and Melissa broke again, collapsing into silence. The tenants eventually heard of that night. Some said it was the first time Melissa had looked human, stripped of her sharp edges. She left the building days later, her pride shattered, her life in pieces. I did not rejoice at her fall. I simply breathed easier knowing her reign of cruelty had ended. The building settled into peace. Tenants who once avoided each other now shared conversations in the halls. My grandson came to visit me more often, his laughter filling rooms that had once echoed with bitterness. Brian helped where he could, repairing small things in the building, trying to stitch together the trust he had let slip through his fingers. It was not perfect, but it was something. As for me, I felt a calm I had not known in years. The scars of humiliation would always remain, but they no longer weighed me down. They had become reminders of what I had survived, of the strength I had uncovered in myself when no one believed I could rise again. I had reclaimed not just my dignity, but my life. Melissa's absence left a void, but it was not an empty one. It was space for healing, for laughter, for quiet moments with my grandson. It was space for my voice, once silenced, to echo freely. Justice had been done. Not in the loudest way, not in the cruelest way, but in a way that left room for healing. I had not just destroyed Melissa, I had forced her to face herself, and in doing so, I found freedom from the fear she had planted in me. The war was over. The wounds remained, but they no longer bled. They reminded me that survival is its own kind of triumph, and that dignity reclaimed is more powerful than any revenge. Sometimes the deepest betrayals come from inside our own homes, and the hardest battles are the ones fought within families. If you've ever had to fight for your dignity against those who should have loved you most, you'll understand this story in your bones. Tell me in the comments how you feel about justice in families like this, and whether true healing is ever possible.